with the exception of a specially organized force composed of Carrier Division 2, Soryu Hiryu, Cruiser Division 8, Tone, Chikuma, and 2 destroyers, which was detached on 16 December by combined fleet order to support the invasion of Wake Island. The task force headed back for the Inland Sea and Hashirajima anchorage, where it arrived on 23 December. The reasons for Admiral Nagumo's decision to retire without further exploiting his success have puzzled naval experts and historians, particularly abroad. I know of only one document which gives the Admiral's own estimate of the situation at the time he made this decision, related to but certainly less logical than the queries concerning Admiral Nagumo's decision. To retire is the speculation so frequently indulged in since the war as to why Japan did not seize Hawaii outright, instead of merely delivering a hit-and-run attack on Pearl Harbor. In the first place, the speculation arises only because the Pearl Harbor attack turned out to be such an unexpectedly great success. At the time the attack was decided upon, we were by no means so confident of success. Indeed, we felt very much as if we were about to pull the eagle's tail feathers. Naturally, nothing so ambitious as the conquest of Hawaii had even entered our calculations. Furthermore, as explained earlier, the primary objective of our initial war strategy was to secure oil resources. The Pearl Harbor attack itself was conceived purely as a supporting operation toward that objective. As our military resources were limited and oil was our immediate goal, there was no reason at this stage to contemplate the seizure of Hawaiian territory. All in all, the Pearl Harbor operation did achieve its basic strategic objective of preventing the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with Japanese operations in the South, but the failure to inflict any damage on the enemy carriers still weighed heavily on the minds of Admiral Nagumo's air staff and flying officers as the task force cruised back toward home waters. We immediately began laying plans for subsequent operations to achieve what we had been unable to accomplish at Pearl Harbor. On the one hand, we labored to perfect a new tactical doctrine for a sea engagement against the enemy carrier force. The essence of this doctrine was the amalgamation of the air units on board all 6 of our carriers into a single powerful attack group of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes, which would strike the enemy all at once in overwhelming strength. We were fully confident that these new tactics would assure us a victory. On the other hand, Commander Genda, as operations officer on Nagumo's staff, gave exhaustive thought to the broader strategic and tactical problems. His conclusion also was that our next operation must be an all-out effort to destroy the enemy carriers. And as a means of luring the enemy out from his base so that we might engage him in battle, he thought that invasion operations should be undertaken against Midway Island and also against Kingman's Reef, 960 miles south-southwest of Pearl Harbor. Thus it was Genda who first thought up the basic idea that 6 months later culminated in the Midway operation. Genda's scheme, of course, met with our wholehearted approval. To us it was the logical way to exploit and complete our initial successes, and we felt that the time to strike was now. So anxious were we to get started that suggestions were even made that the whole task force put into truck to support the Wake invasion and then stand by for operations against the enemy carriers. Upon our return to the homeland, however, we found Japanese naval leaders complacently elated over the destruction of so many battleships at Pearl Harbor and not at all receptive toward plans for prompt follow-up action against the enemy carriers. To my knowledge, the only important naval officer who criticized the failure to inflict any damage on the enemy carriers was Rear Admiral Keizo Ueno, then commander of the Yokosuka Naval Air Corps, Nagumo Force in Southern Operations. By the time the main body of the victorious Pearl Harbor attack force got back to home waters, the key Japanese operations in the southern area were well underway. Army forces were already pushing down the Malay Peninsula toward Singapore. Thailand had been occupied. Conquest of the vital Borneo oil fields had begun with the capture of Miri on 16th December. At Saya, shore-based naval aircraft had scored a signal success only 2 days after the start of hostilities by sinking battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, mainstays of the British Fair Eastern Fleet in the waters east of Malaya. Elsewhere, too, the war was going well for Japan. Conquest of the Philippines, essential to protect the southward line of advance, was proceeding satisfactorily with enemy air opposition smashed and the first of the two main landings on Luzon already accomplished at Lingayen Gulf. The oceanic perimeter to the east had been strengthened by the seizure of Guam in the Marianas, of Makin and Tarawa in the Gilberts, and of Wake, which finally fell under reinforced Japanese assault on 23 December, the same day that the Nagumo force dropped anchor at Hashirajima. Returning amid nationwide rejoicing over Japan's successes everywhere, Admiral Nagumo found that plans had already been made for the next employment of his force. Both the Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet were fully satisfied with the results achieved at Pearl Harbor and saw no need for further neutralizing action against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They had therefore decided to transfer the Nagumo force forthwith to the Southern Theater of Operations, where its first mission was to support the impending invasions of Rabaul and Cavite in the Bismarck Archipelago. Accordingly, the Nagumo force, less the units which had been detached to support the Wake invasion, sortied from the inland sea on January 1942, and after calling briefly at Truk, continued south to launch pre-invasion airstrikes. On 20 January, attack groups took off from the four carriers northeast of New Ireland and struck Rabaul. The following day, Cavite was hit simultaneously with neutralization strikes by aircraft from Zuikaku and Shokaku on airfields Atlai and Salamaua on the eastern New Guinea coast. Nowhere, however, was any appreciable enemy air strength discovered. Leading a powerful force of 90 bombers and fighters in the Rabaul attack, I saw just two enemy planes. They were attempting to take off from one of the two airfields and were promptly disposed of by our fighters. The second airfield was empty. Dive bombers dispatched a lone cargo ship caught in the harbor, and my level bomber group, for lack of any more worthwhile target, finally let loose its full load of 800-kilogram bombs on a coastal gun emplacement commanding the harbor entrance. A further strike on Rabaul was carried out on the 22nd, but it was superfluous. The next day, our landing forces occupied Rabaul and Cavite without a struggle. All in all, the employment of the Nagumo force in this operation struck me as wasteful and extravagant. If ever a sledgehammer had been used to crack an egg, this was the time. The Nagumo force put back to Truk and prepared to set out for the Celebes, where it was to support Southwest area operations. A sudden development intervened, however. Early in the morning of 1st February, the very day we were scheduled to sortie, a report came in that enemy carrier-borne aircraft were attacking the Marshalls. Our departure for the Celebes was immediately called off, and instead we headed eastward at top speed to catch the enemy task force. This impulsive action really made little sense. It would take us 2 full days to cover the 200-mile distance from Truk to the Marshalls, and in that interval the enemy was sure to retire to safety. Nevertheless, I inwardly rejoiced. Futile as it seemed, I thought our mad dash might be just the gesture that was needed to persuade Combined Fleet to redirect the Nagumo force eastward against its logical and potentially most dangerous opponent, the U.S. carrier force. Throughout warned February, reports kept coming in from the Marshalls detailing the enemy raid, but by that night, it was evident that the enemy carriers had already vanished from the area. Still, the Nagumo force kept speeding eastward during 2nd February, and it was only after picking up an American news broadcast announcing the execution of successful raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands that it finally turned back, knowing for certain that the enemy was beyond its grasp. Combined Fleet's reaction, also, proved highly disappointing. It viewed the Marshall's attack merely as an enemy attempt to divert strength from our southern operations. It was quick to criticize the local Island Defense Command for having been taken by surprise, but it failed on its own part to produce any positive and effective plan for dealing with the enemy carrier force. Instead, it took a feeble and purely negative countermeasure, which struck me as worse than no action at all. This countermeasure was an order directing the detachment of Carrier Division 5, Zukaku Shokaku, from the Nagumo force to carry out defensive air patrols east of the homeland. It sprang from combined fleet apprehension that the enemy, having directed a successful carrier strike against the Marshals, might be emboldened to attempt similar strikes against objectives closer to Japan, conceivably even the imperial capital itself. The detachment of the 2 fleet carriers for patrol duty was designed only to guard against this worst eventuality. Unfortunately, its effect was to dissipate the strength of the one Japanese force which, with all 6 of its carriers operating together, could have confidently taken the offensive against any enemy in the Pacific, including the undamaged American carrier force. For the main part of the Nagumo force, however, combined fleet had other ideas. The Hashirajima headquarters continued to focus its attention exclusively on the southern area, where it was now most concerned over probable Allied use of Northwest Australia as a base from which to impede Japanese seizure of the Dutch East Indies. Proposals for mounting an amphibious invasion of Port Darwin met a flat rebuff by the Naval General Staff and the Army, so Combined Fleet decided upon the next best alternative, a carrier airstrike to completely wreck base installations in the area. An order was issued assigning this mission to the Nagumo Force. Less Carrier Division 5, Admiral Nagumo received word of his new assignment as he headed back from the futile sortie toward the Marshals. Since Rear Admiral Yamaguchi's splinter force, which had been operating separately since 16th of December, was to rejoin the main body for the Darwin strike, Admiral Nagumo set his course for Palau and ordered Yamaguchi to rendezvous with him there. En route to Palau, Carrier Division 5 broke away from the main body and headed for the homeland. After completing battle preparations, the Nagumo force, now consisting of carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, battleships Hiei and Kirishima, heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, light cruiser Abukuma, and 9 destroyers, sortied from Palau on 15th February and headed for the Banda Sea. Early in the morning of the 19th, it reached a position about 220 miles north-northwest of Port Darwin and launched a strike of 188 planes under my command. As at Rabaul, the job to be done seemed hardly worthy of the Nagumo force. The harbor, it is true, was crowded with all kinds of ships, but a single pier and a few waterfront buildings appeared to be the only port installations. The airfield on the outskirts of the town, though fairly large, had no more than 2 or 3 small hangars, and in all there were only 20-odd planes of various types scattered about the field. No planes were in the air. A few attempted to take off as we came over, but were quickly shot down, and the rest were destroyed where they stood. While the fighter group went after the enemy planes, I detailed the dive bombers to attack ships in the harbor and led the main strength of my level bombers in an attack on the harbor installations and a nearby cluster of oil tanks. The rest of the level bombers went to destroy the airfield hangars. Anti-aircraft fire was intense but largely ineffectual, and we quickly accomplished our objectives. The final tally was 11 ships, including some destroyers, sunk, over 20 enemy planes destroyed, and all base installations effectively smashed. The Nagumo force withdrew to Staring Bay, on the southeast coast of the Celebes, but did not stay there long. The invasion of Java, culmination of the southern operations, was to begin on 1st March. To support it, the Nagumo force, together with Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's Southern Force main body of 4 battleships, was to skirt around to the south of Java and cut off any possible enemy reinforcement or escape. The combined force sortied from Staring Bay on 25 February and headed into the Indian Ocean through Ombai Strait. On 3rd March, a 180-plane strike was launched from our carriers against the South Javanese port of Cilacap, netting a bag of about 20 ships sunk. In addition, up to 5 March, 3 enemy destroyers and 14 transports were sunk trying to escape southward, and 3 other transports were captured. The landing operations meanwhile went off on schedule, and on 9 March, Java surrendered. The Nagumo force returned to Staring Bay to await orders. By the latter part of March, Sumatra was also in Japanese hands, as were the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. In Burma, Japanese forces had taken Rangoon and were pushing on to the north. To secure these newly won areas and make it possible to supply the Burma forces directly by sea, Combined Fleet decided that it was necessary to strike a blow at British surface and air strength in the Indian Ocean. Enemy forces there were estimated at 2 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 4 to 7 light cruisers, and a number of destroyers, plus a shore-based air strength of about 300 planes. Admiral Kondo, as Commander-in-Chief of Japanese naval forces in Southeast Asia, assigned the mission to the Nagumo Force. Carrier Division 5, detached in February, was now restored to Admiral Nagumo's command for the operation, and the task force was further reinforced by 2 of Admiral Kondo's battleships. Sortying from Staring Bay on 26 March, the force headed into the Indian Ocean and opened its offensive with a surprise airstrike at Colombo, Ceylon, on 5 April. All the carriers that had hit Pearl Harbor were participating except Kaga, which had gone to the homeland for repairs. The first attack wave took off from the carriers at 30 minutes before dawn, about 200 miles south of Ceylon. This force under my command consisted of 36 fighters, 54 dive bombers, and 90 level bombers. We were expecting trouble this time, since an enemy flying boat had spotted us the preceding day and, though shot down by our combat air patrol, had undoubtedly reported the presence of our force. As we closed the target, flying through dense but occasionally broken clouds, I suddenly spotted a formation of 12 enemy swordfish-type torpedo planes. They were flying at a much lower altitude, without any fighter escort, and obviously had not noticed us. I quickly signaled Lieutenant Commander Itaya, the fighter group commander, who was flying to port, to close me. When he had done so, I pointed down toward the enemy formation and motioned for him to attack. After a few moments, Itaya nodded and veered off to lead his fighters against the still unsuspecting enemy. The lumbering swordfish, caught from above, were shot down to the last plane in one swift attack, since the luckless enemy planes must have been on their way to attack our carriers. I was sure now that enemy fighters were out to intercept us. To avoid them, I led the whole attack force around to the north of Colombo, and then we dashed in toward the objective. Still wet from air-sent rain squall, the city lay glistening in the sun. No airborne fighters were visible as we came over, and the big airfield southeast of the city was also empty of planes, so it was apparent that the enemy interceptors had gone south to meet us, while Commander Itaya's fighters and a few of my level bombers headed to attack the airfield. The other level bombers in the dive bomber group struck at shipping in the harbor. No warships were present, but considerable damage was inflicted on cargo vessels, with which the harbor was jammed. As the last bombers made their attack runs, I prepared to radio back to flagship Akagi that our mission was accomplished and that a second wave attack would be unnecessary. Just then a terse message was overheard from one of the Nagumo Force float planes, which had taken off simultaneously with the air attack force to search over a broad sector of the western Indian Ocean. 2 enemy heavy cruisers sighted heading south. It appeared that the enemy had sent out his surface units to attack the Nagumo force, and the consequences might be serious if the air attack force did not get back to the carriers quickly. Immediately ordered all units to reassemble, and we were just about to head for home when some 20 Hurricane fighters appeared from the south. Itaya's Zeros again peeled off and engaged them, while the rest of our force streaked for the carriers. It was hard to leave the fighters to find their way back alone, but it had to be done. Most of them did return safely, but several never made it. Back on Akagi, I was relieved to learn from Commander Genda that the 2 enemy cruisers had been running away, not attacking, and that no other enemy forces had been spotted. The second wave dive bomber group of 80 planes, led by Lieutenant Commander Igusa, was already on its way to attack them. A few minutes later, Igusa radioed, "Enemy sighted." 20 minutes thereafter the attack was over, and both enemy cruisers, identified as Dorsetshire and Cornwall, had been sent to the bottom. The dive bombers scored hits with close to 90% of their bombs, an enviable rate of accuracy, even considering the windless conditions. But rather than feeling exultation over the proficiency of Igusa's bombardiers, I could only feel pity for these surface ships assailed from the air at odds of 40 to 1. The Nagumo force now retired southward beyond range of Ceylon-based air patrols, but a few days later, it again headed north to attack the important British base of Trincomalee, on the east coast of Ceylon. The air task organization was the same as for the Colombo strike. The first Attic wave, which I again led, took off in the pre-dawn darkness of 9 April. The weather was fine. Enemy radar must have detected our approach, for Hurricane fighters came out to intercept before we reached the target. Our fighter group took care of them in short order, however, and we pressed on to launch the attack. As we came in over the base, enemy anti-aircraft batteries immediately put up a heavy barrage. Despite this opposition, the attack was highly effective. Our dive bombers found numerous carrier-type aircraft lined up on the apron of the field and quickly set them ablaze. My level bombers, carrying 800-kilogram bombs, concentrated on the airfield installations and naval base facilities. One of the targets, a munitions depot, went up in a spectacular display of fireworks. Lying in the anchorage were 2 light cruisers, a number of destroyers, and about 10 cargo ships. I detailed some bombers to attack the cruisers, but decided that it would be best to leave the main job of destroying the enemy ships to the dive bomber group of the second attack wave. I radioed back to Akagi to this effect, and our first wave then headed back to the carriers. On the way back there was a repetition of what had occurred on the Colombo strike. One of ours, Urchplanas, was suddenly overheard reporting that it had sighted 2 enemy ships heading south. Only this time, one was a destroyer, the other an aircraft carrier. We opened our throttles and sped for home, not without some apprehension. Luckily, the enemy ships had been spotted before our second wave had taken off for Trincomalee, and by the time we landed on the carriers, Igusa again was leading his dive bombers to attack the enemy. Above, our full combat air patrol was on the alert. Below, on the carriers, there was a steady hum of activity as the planes back from Trincomalee were refueled and rearmed to attack in case Igusa's dive bombers failed to eliminate the enemy carrier. My level bombers were being armed this time with torpedoes. Suddenly, Akagi's loudspeakers blared, "AA action!" Almost simultaneously, there was the stunning noise of bomb explosions, and 6 white columns of water rose off the ship's bow, 4 to starboard and 2 to port. Looking up, I saw a formation of 6 Wellington bombers passing over at 4,000 meters. They had somehow caught our combat air patrol flat-footed, though not for long. The fighters quickly pursued them, and eventually shot down everyone in a running battle. Shortly thereafter, Igusa's dive bombers reached the enemy carrier, which had been identified as Hermes. In a swift 15-minute attack, they sank this carrier and her lone destroyer escort, as well as a large merchant ship which was spotted farther to the north. No fighters were protecting Hermes, nor were there any aircraft on her deck. Just before the attack, she had been overheard, calling repeatedly to Trincomalee asking if fighters had been dispatched. From this, it seemed evident that it was her plane, as we had destroyed on the Trincomalee airfield a few hours earlier. Needless to say, they never rejoined her, nor were there further air attacks on the Nagumo force from any quarter. With the sinking of Hermes, Admiral Nagumo decided to write Finisto the Indian Ocean operation. After recovering Igusa's planes, the force headed eastward for the Strait of Malacca. The first phase operations were now completed, and combined fleet shortly ordered our return to the homeland. On the way, Rear Admiral Hara's Carrier Division 5, Zuikaku Shokaku, was again detached and ordered to Truk, whence it was to sortie in early May to support the planned invasion of Port Moresby, on the southeast coast of New Guinea. As we left the tropic seas behind, I had time to think back on the operations of the past 4 hectic months. In that brief span, the Nagumo force had covered almost 50,000 miles of ocean, ranging all the way from Hawaii nearly to the shores of India. We had acquitted ourselves well in every operation. Morale, along with combat efficiency, had risen steadily. Still, I was convinced now more than ever that the Nagumo force had been improperly and wastefully employed ever since its return from the attack on Pearl Harbor. Where in the southern area Had there been an enemy powerful enough to require the use of our superior striking power, surely the southern operations could have been carried out quite adequately by the naval forces already assigned, without commitment of the Nagumo force in an unneeded and unworthy supporting role. Indeed, it looked to me as if, after Pearl Harbor, the Naval High Command must have thought that there was nothing important for the Nagumo force to do, and so, rather than let it remain idle, had assigned it to secondary missions in the southern area. But was it true that no vital task remained? Were not the Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet forgetting that our main adversary at sea was the United States fleet? And were they not at the same time deliberately closing their eyes to the very lesson that our success at Pearl Harbor had taught, namely, that it was no longer the battleship, but the aircraft carrier, which was the decisive element of fleet strength? The enemy's battleships had been effectively smashed, but his carriers, with the heavy cruisers to screen them, remained unscathed. Therefore, before sending the Nagumo force to the south where it was not really needed, should not Combined Fleet have kept it operating to the east with the paramount mission of destroying the American carrier force? This trend of thought called to my mind the 7 big battleships which had lain idle in the inland sea ever since the outbreak of war, the Hashirajima fleet. If the Nagumo force had been wasted, what about these doughty battle wagons, the supposed heart and core of the Japanese fleet's combat strength? Evidently, the idea was to save them for the great decisive battle which our fleet strategists had long planned to fight in a war against the United States, a contest in which the battleships of the two fleets would slug it out with their big guns in approved World War I style. At Pearl Harbor, however, Japanese carrier air power had smashed the enemy's battleships, and with them, the myth of battleship supremacy. Thus, on 2 counts at once, the retention of the Hashirajima fleet, under wraps at its inland sea anchorage as a decisive battle force, became meaningless. Yet there it was kept, contributing no more to the prosecution of the war than the enemy battleships left in wreckage at Pearl Harbor. One cannot help wondering what might have been the course of the war had our top naval command been more prompt to revise its outmoded thinking in the light of new experience. Suppose it had fully absorbed the lesson of Pearl Harbor and had recognized without delay that the Nagumo force with its 6 carriers, not the 7 battleships at Hashirajima, constituted the main combat strength of the Japanese fleet. Suppose, having recognized this, that it had fused the Nagumo force and the 7 idle battleships into a single powerful carrier task force, with the battleships in a supporting role, and had assigned to it the sole mission of operating eastward to complete the destruction of the United States fleet. It is undoubtedly too much to say that, had this been done, the ultimate outcome of the war at sea would have been different. At the very least, however, it seems reasonable to believe that the American carrier force, which had survived Pearl Harbor, could speedily have been crushed, and that the Japanese fleet would not nearly so soon have lost its advantage to an enemy who was quicker to learn from defeat than our naval leaders were to learn from victory. Debate on future strategy, eastward versus westward. Advance at the start of the Pacific War, Japan's strategy makers had been so engrossed in the immediate problem of acquiring oil resources that they had formulated no concrete strategic program for the ensuing course of hostilities after these resources had been won. Also, they had been keenly conscious of the many risks involved in the initial operations, the Pearl Harbor attack not the least of such risks, and had by no means been certain of the outcome. They therefore had decided to wait and see how the operations progressed before attempting to formulate subsequent war strategy. By early January of 1942, Japanese successes on all fronts had assured the planners that the first phase operations would be completed without a hitch, and accordingly, they began weighing the problem of future strategy. Many vital questions posed themselves. With her initial strategic objectives attained, should Japan go on the defensive to hold what she had won, or should she remain boldly on the offensive in an effort to break the fighting determination of the Allies? If the latter, should she first strike westward against Britain or eastward against the United States, and specifically, what offensive action would be most effective? In theory, the formulation of Army and Navy strategic policies was the function, respectively, of the Army and Naval General Staffs operating as sections of Imperial General Headquarters. The Chief of Naval General Staff was automatically Chief of the Navy Section of Imperial General Headquarters, and in the latter capacity issued orders and directives to Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, embodying top-level strategic and operational decisions. Actually, however, Combined Fleet, rather than the Naval General Staff, often played the dominant role in shaping fleet strategy. Time had been when Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet was a naval commander in the true Nelsonian tradition, who led the fleet in battle and issued orders from the bridge of his flagship amidst a hail of enemy fire. But owing to the expansion of the naval establishment and the vast enlargement of operational theaters, it had become difficult for the Commander-in-Chief to exercise overall tactical command if he went to sea with the combat forces. So Combined Fleet became primarily a shore-based headquarters, which, in addition to planning and directing tactical operations, exerted a potent and frequently decisive influence on the formulation of basic fleet strategy. Combined Fleet's ability to impress its views on the highest organ of naval command had been demonstrated at the start of the war by Admiral Yamamoto's successful insistence upon the Pearl Harbor attack over strong naval general staff opposition. Needless to say, the striking victories won by the fleet in the first month of hostilities served only to reinforce this influence. Combined Fleet staff officers were filled with elated self-confidence, while the Naval General Staff felt constrained to talk softly in its dealings with the fleet headquarters. It was not surprising, therefore, that the initiative in formulating naval strategy for the second phase of the war was taken by Combined Fleet rather than by the Naval General Staff. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Combined Fleet Chief of Staff, began studying the problem toward the middle of January, on board flagship Nagato anchored in Hiroshima Bay. According to his diary, he spent 4 days in quiet and exhaustive deliberation. The first phase of offensive operations, he estimated, would be largely accomplished by the middle of March, which meant that a decision on subsequent strategy should be reached by the end of February at the latest. Ugaki concluded first of all that the Japanese armed forces, instead of reverting to a defensive strategy, which would yield the initiative to the enemy, must remain vigorously on the offensive. As to the direction of the next offensive move, he considered 3 major alternatives: toward Australia, toward India, or toward Hawaii. His final conclusion was in favor of a move against Hawaii, to be initiated with preliminary operations in June for the seizure of Midway, Johnston, and Palmyra Islands. As soon as adequate air strength had been moved up to these advanced bases, amphibious operations would be launched against Hawaii itself, with the main strength of Combined Fleet advancing to Hawaiian waters to support the invasion and, if possible, challenge the U.S. fleet in decisive battle. The reasons which impelled Ugaki to favor this plan. Admiral Ugaki promptly instructed subordinate staff officers to make a detailed study of the practicability of his plan. The conclusion reached, however, proved negative on 3 principal grounds. First, the Japanese forces could no longer expect to achieve surprise as in the Pearl Harbor attack. Second, it would be beyond the capability of the Japanese air strength which could be brought to bear, both carrier and shore-based, to gain control of the skies over so large an area as the Hawaiian Islands, where the enemy air forces would be widely dispersed. Third, in a contest between ships and shore batteries, the odds would be against the former. In view of these unfavorable findings, Admiral Ugaki reluctantly set aside his plan and directed the Combined Fleet staff to begin studying an alternative scheme of offensive operations to the west, advanced by the senior fleet operations officer, Captain Kameto Kuroshima. Ugaki, who did not fully concur in Kuroshima's ideas, instructed that the study be carried out subject to the following conditions. Although there appeared to be no imminent danger of Soviet-Japanese hostilities, sufficient precautions should be taken to meet such an eventuality. Similarly, adequate measures should be provided to suppress hit-and-run attacks by U.S. carrier task forces from the east. Launching of any operations to the west should await refitting of the naval forces, following completion of the first phase operations and also should be timed to synchronize with German offensives in the Near and Middle East. The objectives of the Western operations would have to be clearly defined from the start. They would be A. Destruction of the British fleet, B. Capture of strategic points and elimination of enemy bases, and C. Establishment of contact between the Japanese and European Axis forces. Thus, Combined Fleet began its study of the Kuroshima Plan with the idea that the proposed westward operations would be part of a closely coordinated Axis offensive from two directions. However, this concept suffered an early setback when the headquarters received a copy of the new tripartite Axis military agreement concluded on 19th January. The agreement, though it made passing reference to Germany's advance eastward and Japan's advance westward, said nothing at all with regard to a future joint offensive effort. Ugaki was keenly disappointed and concluded that, rather than attempt to coordinate her action with that of the European Axis, Japan could best promote overall Axis success by fixing her own strategy independently. Hence, the idea of a joint offensive was abandoned, and Combined Fleet continued its study of the Western operations as a purely Japanese project. The primary tactical objectives were to B. Destruction of the British fleet, capture of Ceylon, and acquisition of air control over the Indian Ocean. The broader strategic aims were to safeguard the Dutch East Indies and Malaya against Athrete from the west, and to facilitate an early juncture with German forces in the Near East. By late February, the study had been completed and a tentative plan worked out. The plan was then put to the test in a wargame staged on board super battleship Yamato, which had just been designated flagship of Combined Fleet. The game continued over a 4-day period with representatives of the Naval General Staff attending. As a result, the Naval General Staff formulated an official Navy plan for the Western operations, and this was laid before a joint conference of the Army and Navy sections of Imperial General Headquarters in the middle of March. The Navy plan, which envisaged amphibious operations against Ceylon, of course required the participation of Army forces. The Army, however, voiced strong opposition on the ground that it had to be on guard against the Soviet Union, and therefore could not afford to extend itself any further in Southeast Asia. From the Navy viewpoint, this argument appeared somewhat specious in view of the Army's current operations in Burma, but specious or not, the Army's refusal to cooperate meant that the proposed offensive in the Indian Ocean could not be carried out. Combined Fleet nevertheless remained convinced that it must take the offensive somewhere as soon as possible. The headquarters therefore resumed its planning studies looking toward offensive operations to the east, this time lowering its sights somewhat from the earlier Ugaki plan to invade Hawaii and envisaging operations which could be carried out by naval forces alone or with minimum Army participation. A factor of key importance at this stage was the increasingly alarming activity of enemy carrier task forces which, since the beginning of February, had successively attacked the Marshalls, Rabaul, Wake, Marcus Island, and eastern New Guinea. To curb this activity, the Combined Fleet planners concluded that it was advisable to seize Midway Island, only 1,130 miles from Hawaii, as an advance base for air patrols. At the same time, they calculated that a move against Midway would draw out the enemy fleet so that it could be destroyed in decisive battle. The preparatory studies conducted by Admiral Ugaki and the staff of Combined Fleet had now progressed as far as they could without a decision by the Commander-in-Chief. Admiral Yamamoto had not intervened in the planning activities of his subordinates and had taken no part in the protracted debate on eastward versus westward advance. Now, however, the decision was up to him, and he quickly and strongly came out in favor of the proposed eastward offensive. Accordingly, on 29 and 30 March, a preliminary plan was drawn up at Combined Fleet Headquarters for the Midway operation. All that was now needed to put the plan into final form was the sanction of the Naval General Staff. The latter had been briefly informed, around the middle of March, that Combined Fleet was studying plans for an attack on Midway, but no further discussions had taken place. Consequently, on 2nd April, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, operations officer on Admiral Yamamoto's staff, was sent to Tokyo to present officially the preliminary combined fleet plan. He quickly discovered that the plan would not have easy sailing. The Australia First School, while combined fleet had displayed greater energy and initiative in planning second phase naval strategy, the Naval General Staff had not exactly been idle. Its main attention, however, had been focused on an area different from either of the two major alternatives considered by combined fleet. This was the so-called Southeast area, centering on the Australian subcontinent. Neither Admiral Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, nor his deputy chief, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, was the kind of officer who actively directed the planning of his subordinates. They allowed the staff to take the initiative and express themselves only when a plan had been drafted and submitted for their approval. Naval General Staff thinking, therefore, was largely the thinking of the plan's division of its First Operations Section. Rear Admiral Shigeru Fuku Dome headed the first section, and under him the plans division was led by Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka. It was Tomioka who sparked the Australia First School of Strategy. The key importance of Australia in the minds of the Tomioka group stemmed from their estimate that the subcontinent, because of its size and strategic location on the Japanese defensive perimeter, would almost certainly become the springboard for an eventual Allied counteroffensive. This counteroffensive, they reasoned, would be spearheaded by air power in order to take full advantage of American industrial capacity to produce planes by mass production methods, and the effective utilization of this massive air strength would require the use of land bases in Australia. Consequently, there would be a weak spot in Japan's defensive armor unless Australia were either placed under Japanese control or effectively cut off from the United States. Following the easy conquest of the Bismarcks in January, the most aggressive proponents of the Australia First concept started advocating outright occupation of key areas in Australia. This extreme initial proposal, however, was speedily rejected by the Army, which flatly stated that it could not scrape together the more than 10 combat divisions that would be required for such an operation, not to mention the impossibility of amassing enough ships to transport such a force and keep it supplied. The reasons for the rejection were persuasive enough, but Navy circles suspected that they were a camouflage for the Army's real intentions. The Army High Command, it was surmised, was confidently counting upon the success of the major offensive, which Germany planned to launch in the Caucasus in the spring. Such success, of course, would radically alter the European war situation in Germany's favor, and it was suspected that the Army desired to hold back a large part of its forces with a view to committing them on the continent against Russia when this favorable situation developed. In any event, it was abundantly clear that the Army did not want to commit substantial forces to the southeast area and would have no part of an attempt to invade Australia. The Naval General Staff strategists therefore began concentrating their efforts on less ambitious plans to isolate Australia and cut off the flow of American war materiel by gradually extending Japanese control over eastern New Guinea, the Solomons, and the New Caledonia Fiji Islands area. By early April, when Combined Fleet presented its Midway attack plan, a beginning had already been made toward carrying out the Naval General Staff program. Lae and Salamaua, in eastern New Guinea, had been occupied as the first step, and the Army had agreed to the use of its South Seas Detachment currently at Rabaul in the second move, the simultaneous invasion of Port Moresby on the southeast New Guinea coast and of Tulagi in the Solomons. The Port Moresby-Tulagi operations were waiting only upon the dispatch of one of Admiral Nagumo's carrier divisions to reinforce the naval covering forces. Meanwhile, the Naval General Staff was already trying to talk the Army into participating in further invasion operations against New Caledonia, the Fiji Islands, and Samoa, as soon as Port Moresby and Tulagi had been taken. In view of these circumstances, the combined fleet plan for Midway could hardly have come at a more inauspicious moment. The plan specifically provided that the move against Midway, to be accompanied by a diversionary invasion of the Western Aleutians, be carried out in the early part of June, and that the New Caledonia Fiji Samoa operations proposed by the Naval General Staff be deferred until after the completion of the Midway Aleutians venture. Thus, the stage was set for another crucial test of strength between Combined Fleet and the Naval General Staff to see which would have the more powerful voice in determining fleet strategy. Midway debate discussions concerning the Midway Plan promptly got underway on 2nd April with a lengthy exchange of views between Commander Watanabe, representing Combined Fleet, and Commander Tatsukichi Mio, 1st Section Air Officer representing the Naval General Staff. Commander Mio pleaded vigorously, and on occasion almost tearfully, against the plan, voicing a long series of objections ranging from the difficulty of amassing the vast amount of material required to the unfavorable tactical aspects of the operation itself and the questionable strategic value of Midway, even if it were successfully occupied. As far as material requirements were concerned, Commander Mio argued that prior execution of the New Caledonia Fiji Samoa operations, as planned by the Naval General Staff, would be more feasible since, in fact, some preparations had already been started. He emphasized particularly that it would be next to impossible, owing to the short supply of aircraft and air materiel in general, to re-equip the depleted air groups of Admiral Nagumo's carriers in time to meet the Combined Fleet attack deadline. The problem of aircraft supply was one that directly concerned Mio, since it was his responsibility to see that naval air units engaged in combat operations were furnished with necessary plane replacements. The situation was indeed becoming increasingly serious. Every air unit was supposed to be equipped with reserve aircraft amounting to 1/3 of its regular operational complement. Actually, the vast majority of units not only had no reserve planes whatever, but were below normal operating strength. Mio had just been obliged to shunt aside an urgent request from the shore-based 11th Air Fleet for enough planes to bring its units up to operational level, proffering the excuse that even carrier Ryujo had not yet been equipped with Zero fighters to replace her outmoded Type 96 planes. Having set forth the Naval General Staff's arguments against the Midway operation, Commander Mio proceeded to defend its alternative plan for a move against New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. He emphasized that although these islands were situated farther from Japan than Midway, they were almost equally distant from the United States' main Hawaii base, so that one advantage the American forces would have in defending Midway would be nullified. Also, the size of the islands as compared with Midway would make them of much greater military value. As for drawing out the American fleet so that it could be engaged in decisive battle, Commander Mio argued that operations against New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would be more likely to achieve this objective than an assault on Midway, because Australia would feel itself seriously threatened and would undoubtedly appeal for American naval assistance. The United States would be strongly impelled to act even without such an appeal, since severance of the American supply route to Australia would effectively block the eventual use of Australia as an Allied counter-offensive base. Finally, the Naval General Staff believed that the successful seizure of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would so seriously lower Australian and, indirectly, Allied morale that it would contribute more toward shortening the war than any other move which Japan could make. While advancing all these arguments, Commander Mio nevertheless refrained from voicing a flat rejection of the Combined Fleet plan. Instead, on Thursday, April, the Naval General Staff re-examined the situation in regard to materiel and supplies and concluded that about 70% of Combined Fleet's estimated requirements for the Midway operation could be met. Conference were resumed on 4 April between Commander Watanabe and members of the Naval General Staff, but failed to bring about any concession by either side. On 5 April, the talks continued, this time with Vice Admiral Ito and Rear Admiral Fukudome attending for the Naval General Staff. In the middle of the conference, Commander Watanabe telephoned directly to Combined Fleet Headquarters on board flagship Yamato and reported the Naval General Staff's views, requesting instructions as to what stand he should take. After returning to his seat, he stated Admiral Yamamoto's position in the following uncompromising terms. In the last analysis, the success or failure of our entire strategy in the Pacific will be determined by whether or not we succeed in destroying the United States fleet. more particularly its carrier task forces. The Naval General Staff advocates severing the supply line between the United States and Australia. It would seek to do this by placing certain areas under Japanese control, but the most direct and effective way to achieve this objective is to destroy the enemy's carrier forces, without which the supply line could not in any case be maintained. We believe that by launching the proposed operations against Midway, we can succeed in drawing out the enemy's carrier strength and destroying it in decisive battle. If, on the other hand, the enemy should avoid our challenge, we shall still realize an important gain by advancing our defensive perimeter to Midway and the western Aleutians without obstruction. The statement made it quite evident that Admiral Yamamoto had no intention of giving in to the objections of the Naval General Staff. Since there appeared to be no other way out of the deadlock, Rear Admiral Fukudome turned to Vice Admiral Ito and reluctantly proposed that the Naval General Staff agree to the attack on Midway. Ito quietly nodded his assent. An accord was thus hammered out on the basic policy of executing the Midway operation, but Combined Fleet and the Naval General Staff continued to disagree on the time of execution. The Naval General Staff strongly urged that D-Day, which Combined Fleet proposed to fix early in June, be postponed about 3 weeks in order to allow more time for preparations. Combined Fleet, however, stood pat on its original proposal, arguing that it was essential to launch the attack when the moon would be full, and that a delay of an entire month might seriously reduce the chances of success. On 13 April, Commander Akira Sasaki, Fleet Aviation Officer, was sent to Tokyo to underline these points to the Naval General Staff. In contrast to the strong opposition which it had evoked from the Naval General Staff, the Combined Fleet Plan won the concurrence of the Army General Staff without difficulty. The Army's ready agreement to cooperate, however, was not due to any particular change of heart toward Navy policies, but rather to the fact that the Midway Aleutians operations were to be predominantly naval in character, and the Army would have to furnish only a small number of troops to reinforce the Navy's special landing forces. Among the lower echelon fleet commands, reactions to the Midway Plan varied. Vice Admiral Moshiro Hosagaya's Fifth Fleet, assigned to guarding the northeastern approaches to the homeland, had long been eager to see a major operation launched on the eastern seafront and naturally welcomed the Combined Fleet Plan. On the other hand, Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara's 11th Air Fleet operating in Southeast Asia was somewhat disappointed. It had expected, on the basis of the atmosphere prevailing at Combined Fleet headquarters in early March, that the next big operation would take place in the Indian Ocean, and had already moved its headquarters to Bangkok as a preparatory step. Its shore-based planes would be unable to play any part in the assault on Midway. The only forthright opposition within Combined Fleet came from Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inouye's Fourth Fleet, responsible for operations in a broad sector of the Southwest Pacific. An early stage of the planning for the Midway operation, Combined Fleet headquarters had dispatched its logistics officer to Truk to confer with Vice Admiral Inouye and his staff concerning the problem of transporting supplies to Midway after its occupation, a mission which was to be assigned to Fourth Fleet. Apparently, however, Inouye felt that, considering Japan's limited resources, the seizure of Midway would dangerously overextend the area which would have to be defended. He bluntly stated that he had no confidence in Fourth Fleet's ability to fulfill the mission of supplying the island, whereupon the Combined Fleet representative is said to have angrily left the room, declaring that, since Fourth Fleet could not be relied upon, the mission would be transferred to the shore-based air forces. 2 fleet commanders who were to play leading roles in the Midway operation, Vice Admiral Kondo of Second Fleet and Vice Admiral Nagumo of First Air Fleet, were not consulted at all during the elaboration of the Combined Fleet Plan. Both of these fleets were actively engaged in the southern operations until mid-April, and Admiral Yamamoto did not wish to divert their attention from the tasks at hand by asking them to participate in the Midway planning. As a result of the lack of consultation, however, the question arises whether Combined Fleet was able to frame its plan on the basis of an accurate knowledge of the condition of these two key forces. The middle of April found Combined Fleet and the Naval General Staff still haggling over various details of the Midway Plan, and it was evident that the latter, in spite of having consented in principle, remained highly skeptical about the whole operation. On 18th of April, however, a development intervened which quickly put an end to further debate. Doolittle ends debate concern over enemy air threat, despite Japan's glowing successes on every front in the first 4 months of the Pacific War, April of 1942, found her Army and especially her Navy leaders unable to free their minds of one ever-present and highly disturbing worry. This was the possibility of a sneak enemy air attack on Tokyo, the capital of the empire, the severe damage done to the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor, and the seizure of American bases in the Western Pacific eliminated for some time at least. Any fear of sustained, large-scale enemy air action against the homeland, either carrier or shore-based. Still, the enemy's carriers and heavy cruisers, which had escaped injury, remained capable of at least sporadic small-scale attacks of a hit-and-run variety. These, it was feared, might be undertaken as moves in the wear-off nerves or as a shot in the arm to revive flagging American morale at home. For such guerrilla raids, Tokyo seemed a likely target. Obviously, the physical damage that might be inflicted on the capital by raids of this kind was hardly enough to warrant the exaggerated concern felt by Army and Navy leaders. Their sharp sensitivity to the enemy air threat was largely a spontaneous and unreasoned expression of the almost religious devotion to the emperor, which has long characterized the Japanese national psychology. The fighting services especially were imbued with the idea that their foremost duty was to protect the emperor from danger. Naturally, they felt that it would be a grave dereliction of this duty if the emperor's safety were jeopardized by even a single enemy raid on Tokyo. Under the terms of an Army-Navy agreement covering defense of the homeland, primary responsibility for defense against air attack rested with the Army. Nevertheless, a lane share of responsibility still rested on the shoulders of the Navy, since any air attack at this stage would have to be seaborne, and it was the Navy's job to intercept and destroy enemy carrier striking forces at sea before they could penetrate within striking distance. Admiral Yamamoto, as Supreme Commander of the fleet, was particularly conscious of this naval responsibility. He himself, by the surprise carrier strike on Pearl Harbor, had set an example which the enemy might follow. Also, he knew from first-hand observation the bold aggressiveness of the American national character, and suspected that the United States fleet would attempt at the earliest opportunity to strike back at the Japanese homeland with a carrier task force.